Okay, so next let's discuss the cluster. You can do this. You can use a cluster on anything that has vertices or anything like vertices in it. So we'll I'm going to delete history on this mesh because I kind of like that shape. It's kind of fun. And delete history on it, and you'll see that the lattice goes away, and all I'm left with is the box. Okay, now when I create a cluster, there's hardly any options for it. It's one of the very first deformers that existed in Maya. If you go to the advanced options, there's really not any extra stuff there. Anyway, so I'm going to click it, click create, and it's going to put a cluster on the entire object, and it's going to control the entire object the same, but it doesn't have to. Now, it should be said that when you're using clusters in a rig, you'll want, and this will make more sense later, but you don't want to parent the cluster handle to anything that's going to move with your rig. You want to parent constrain it, and that will make more sense later, but I got to say that now because that's a big problem that we run into in rigging. Now, if I select the mesh, and this is the beginning of the deformers that allow us to adjust the weighting. So I can right click on this mesh and go to Paint, Cluster, Cluster Weights. And then I can double click over here on the left in my toolbar to open up my tool settings, and it's going to allow me to adjust how much area this cluster controls. So before I do that, it's easier sometimes to have moved the object so you can, as you're painting a weight, you can see the results. So select that and then select the mesh again and press Y to reuse the last tool. And I'm going to click on replace, and I'm going to change the value in my tool to 0. So I'm going to replace. Right now it's all white because every vertex, because in essence you're painting vertices when you do this. Every vertex is following the cluster 100%. That is what white represents by default. I'm going to replace it with 0. To change your brush size, all you have to do is hold down B on your keyboard. You have to have the panel view activated. So when you need to activate a panel, you'll middle mouse click in it. Because if you left click, you'll lose your selection or do something you didn't really want to do. Anyway, if I hold down B with my mouse over the object, I can change the size of my brush. Okay, so I'm going to replace with 0. And you can see that I'm actually adjusting how this mesh is controlled by the cluster. So this usually does there's a lot of clicking when you're painting weights. This is painting weights. If you've heard that term and you didn't know what it was before, now you do. Now it's really handy to have a tablet when you're painting weights. And so you can just get a lot more strokes in a lot easier. So I switched to my tablet. I'm going to increase my brush size, and I've changed my tool to smooth. And now I can smooth the transition between these points, and you can see it in the mesh, how the weight distribution is being smoothed. And this is good. This is what I want. Now let's say I'm grabbing the bottom down here, and I didn't really want to do that. So what we can do, so I can go back into my regular selection mode and go to component mode, and I can control what I have the ability to edit. So I'm going to select all this stuff on the bottom. and make sure I only have the stuff on the bottom. Then I can go back to my Paint Weights tool, and now I can only paint weights on the vertices that I have selected. Okay, so now I can do this, add to 100%, and click flood. But actually I did the opposite of what I intended to do. I need to replace to 0. I wanted it to not have any influence. Okay, and then click flood, and now you can see that all the vertices that I selected, I missed a couple, are now flat on the bottom. They're not affected by this cluster at all. Now I'm spending a lot of time on this. I understand that, but you will spend a lot of time doing this as well. Not necessarily with clusters. Some of it will be with clusters, but mostly with smooth skin. And the weight painting happens the exact same way with the smooth skin. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to my selection mode. I'm going to grab these last two vertices. Make sure I really got them this time. Go back to my weight painting mode and replace 0, flood it, and now everything's at the bottom. Okay. So I'm going to switch back to my selection tool. I'm going to select everything on the bottom. And then I'm going to invert my selection by holding down Shift and dragging over the entire mesh. And then I'll press Y on my keyboard to reuse the last tool. And I'm going to go back to my smooth option and switch to my pen and tablet, and I'm just going to smooth it. Now what's important to notice when you're painting weights and your mesh is being deformed by it is you want the mesh to be as evenly distributed as possible. So on this area I haven't smoothed yet, say right in here, right here in the center of my cursor, the UVs in this area are being stretched deluxe. So the texture on this object is going to be stretched, and it will look bad when it renders. And so we want to be conscious of that as we're painting our weights. We don't want any one group of faces to be stretched too much, or it's not going to look good on our texture. And that's one of the things they would look for in a demo reel if you were trying to get a job as a character TD. Now, one thing to take into account, when you're smoothing, it takes into account all the vertices that are encompassed in the cursor area, and it smooths with those. And so if I were to change my brush size, something smaller, and now it only encompasses 3 vertices, right? It's only going to take those 3 vertices into account when it's smoothing, meaning when it does a smooth operation, it checks the weighting information for all the vertices within the cursor range plus their neighbors, plus their direct neighbors, I should say, and then it will smooth them to try to match. So they'll try to make them all match. Okay, so I'm going to increase my brush size again, and I'm going to smooth this, and you'll see that we can get a nice effect this way. Not sure what the point is on a cube, but we can get a nice transition and it'll be kind of fun. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to object mode, press F8 on my keyboard. I'm going to select the cluster, go back to my mouse. Now if I move this cluster, I get some kind of fun abilities to move it around. Now imagine that this was on a cartoon character's head or something, maybe their arm.